Welcome to Ballot Battleground Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Margiott, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. Should Nevada voters get to decide if public money is used for the A's baseball stadium in Las Vegas? That question is now in the hands of the Nevada Supreme Court. The state's high court will have a lot of say over what could appear on your ballot in November. Justices are already weighing proposed ballot questions dealing with redistricting, reproductive freedoms, and now this one, heard yesterday in Las Vegas. It dates back to last summer when Nevada lawmakers in a special session passed Senate Bill 1, approving up to $380 million in state and county funds for constructing a new stadium to be built on the Las Vegas Strip for the Oakland Athletics. But the Nevada State Education Association has been opposed from the start, repeating over and over their mantra, schools over stadiums. They believe with Nevada school funding and outcomes remaining near the bottom among U.S. states, that public money shouldn't be spent helping a professional sports owner build a new stadium. They filed a referendum seeking to ask voters whether to repeal the public funding portions of Senate Bill 1 and throw the baseball stadium plan into jeopardy. The legality of that referendum has been challenged by lobbyists with ties to the A's and has now been appealed to the Nevada Supreme Court, which will soon have the final say. We'll get into the legal arguments in just a minute, but first let's take you inside the courtroom in Las Vegas. It's Tuesday afternoon, and justices are hearing from both sides in this fight over the A's stadium ballot question. Starting with Frank Flaherty, the attorney for Schools Over Stadiums, the Political Action Committee, or PAC, associated with the Nevada State Education Association.
And the reality in this case is, for SOS PAC, it's not supposed to be this hard. Okay, the hard part is supposed to be getting enough signatures to get this thing on the ballot. And then if you clear that hurdle, convincing the voters to disapprove of the referred sections, okay? That's not supposed to be hard at the beginning.
He's asking justices to rule in their favor and allow the ballot question quickly. If this ballot question were to be allowed, they would need to get over 102,000 signatures across Nevada by June 26th.
The appellants respectfully request that this court issue an immediate order reversing the district court and dissolving its injunction.
On the other side is attorney Bradley Schrager, arguing the ballot question is invalid. He says it's problematic and misleading because it doesn't include the full text of Senate Bill 1, only the parts that would be removed.
Now, if you were doing an entire statute, this issue we're talking about wouldn't matter, right? There it would be. The measure proposed would be the thing, because it would all be subsumed within one text. We are getting rid of this statute, right? In the context of when a part is being targeted, you have a different situation. You have a situation in which people would need to be informed what this excision is going to do to the law, because the law is still going to stand.
At least one justice seemed more sympathetic to that argument that the full text of the original measure is necessary so the voters can have all the context before voting. Here's Justice Linda Marie Bell.
I had to read this description. Actually, I just couldn't even understand it. I had to read the changes in the statute to understand what the changes were supposed to be. I mean, it just doesn't seem to be in any kind of plain language that a person could understand.
We wanted to bring Bradley Schrager on this podcast, but he referred all questions to Oakland A's representatives who weren't made available in time for this episode. But we are going to hear from the Nevada State Education Association today. Their director of strategy, Alexander Marks, he's been lobbying in Carson City against using public money for the stadium from the start and was able to join us to talk about their continued fight against the public funding for this project. I'm so pleased to be joined now by Alexander Marks, the Director of Strategy for the Nevada State Education Association. Alexander, I've interviewed you several times outside and inside the legislature in Carson City. I think you're known as one of the better dressed lobbyists there in Carson City. Good to see you virtually this time.
That's good to see you too. If that's all I'm known for in Carson City, I'll take it after almost a decade in politics.
Well, you are representing the Nevada State Education Association. For our listeners and viewers, more important than how you're dressed in the legislative building is your role as their director of strategy. What is that organization? What do you guys hope to do? And then same with Schools Over Stadiums, the PAC that was more recently founded.
Yeah, so the Nevada State Education Association, we say, is the voice of Nevada educators for over 125 years. We represent teachers, education support professionals, and other licensed professionals throughout the state of Nevada. Anything that touches public education is something that we probably got our hands on. We are the Nevada affiliate for the NEA, which is the National Education Association. That's the largest labor union in the country. So how we got involved with Schools Over Stadiums was towards the end of the regular session, which led into a special session. Was the $380 million giveaway to billionaire John Fisher for another publicly funded stadium. So we launched because we had to, right? Our measure mentioned in terms of education, we're 48th in terms of ranking. We have the largest class sizes in the country. We've got some of the highest vacancies. So when we launched, it was kind of in response to that stadium effort, because if the state had $380 million for a stadium, we need $380 million more in public education. That's not going to solve every single one of our issues, but it would go a long way towards, reducing our class sizes, for example. So it was a natural fit. We have a whole campaign called Public Money in Public Schools, which is usually around our voucher program when they're trying to fund, private vouchers for unaccountable private schools. So this just fit right in our mission statement.
We'll back up a little bit to the end of the 2023 legislative session where you and I and everyone else is in the building covering it and waiting to see what happens. The A's measure doesn't get in time for the regular session. The governor calls a special legislative session that summer, shortly after the regular session had ended, summer of 2023. From your perspective as the lawmakers in, I believe, 6 or 7 days, passed this Senate Bill 1 providing all this public money for the Oakland A stadium in Vegas. How did that session go? Because I think there were a lot of criticisms that not much of the process was very open or transparent.
Yeah, it was not a transparent process at all. I think it was about 8 days total, but I mean, they were back home for weekends and that kind of thing. But, where they really lost a lot of folks and, some folks lost some credibility, in my opinion, was when the Senate hadn't even finished vetting the bill or even voting on it before the Assembly started debating it. And what they did was they called it an informational hearing or informational presentation. That looked suspiciously like a bill hearing. So when they did that meant that they didn't have to take support or opposition testimony. And then from there, they also limited the telephonic testimony. So they cut that off, and it was basically limited to physically in person at Grant Sawyer in Las Vegas or at the legislature in Carson City. So why that's wrong is because there's a lot of folks around Nevada who can't get to the legislature. One of the best things that we started implementing was this telephonic call-in support testimony. When you cut that out, you're losing your native populations, you're losing your ADA accommodation population. So those folks are not able to participate in their government. The cynical reason why they did that is because they didn't want folks from California calling in. California, especially Oakland folks, are livid at this deal, and livid for a good reason. Essentially, they're just trying to warn the legislature of what happens when you get into business with John Fisher, who at this point is the worst owner in all of sports. He's untrustworthy. He's pitting communities against each other. His track record is abysmal, whether you're just looking at the far right wing groups he donates to or just how he treats his players and organization. So a lot of it was just trying to educate our legislature on, hey, if you give this guy money, you have been put on notice that whatever happens after is on you. And so when you shut those voices out, that's an important part to the vetting of a bill. We're dealing with public money here. So who gets that public money is also a very important consideration. And they gave it to literally the worst person they possibly could have given it to.
Yeah, long story short, the Nevada legislature in that pretty quick special session approves Senate Bill 1 with bipartisan support, but not in the way that we would normally see, where it's, say, all the Democrats and a handful of Republicans. It was a smattering of some Democrats and some Republicans. You had progressives that were very opposed to this for certain reasons, conservatives that were opposed to this for different reasons. So it's kind of an interesting coalition that ultimately came together to pass this. In total, $380 million in, or up to $380 million in public funds. Explain, because it's a little confusing, I think. There's some state money, there's some Clark County money, different pots of funds here. Explain how that works.
Yeah, so I think the important thing to note is this is public money. So there's a lot of folks I've heard, and the old adage in politics is if you're explaining, you're losing. They know it's public money. So from there, they're trying to get cute and go, well, it's not really money we have yet, or it's pretend money. I'm sure a lot of folks would like to say that about their law school loans. I'm for one. It seems like real money when I get my statement every month. So loans have to be paid back. So how they decided to pay this with public money is about $180 million in transferable tax credits, and then another 150 down, or 120 rather, in bonding in the local level. So the transferable tax credits come out of the general fund. Pretty easy to understand that if your tax liability is decreased, that's less money going into essential services like public education. They're going to sell those to somebody for something at some point. It'll probably be MGM. And now MGM is paying less taxes into the larger pot. And why that matters is because when we changed the funding formula a few years ago, as complicated as it is, even though they sold it as a transparent new plan for Nevada's kids and schools and all that, essentially 40% of every dollar would go into the new education pot. So, any dollar that this stadium is taking away, that's 40% less that would get to education. And I think that's the easiest way to explain it. So moving down to the county with the bonds, we've got $150 million in bonds that the county can give after a bunch of other things happen. That would basically be an entire stadium district that is walled off from having to pay 40% on every dollar to education, because instead of paying it to the general fund and education, it's going to pay back county bonds. So that money's not even going to go to our roads or anything in Clark County. It's only going to go to pay off these bonds. We currently have the Trop site. I know they closed it, but if you had built a casino there or just kept the Trop open, for instance, what happens is Tropicana has LET tax. It's got property. It's got gaming. It's got a whole other a bunch of taxes. I don't know what the exact percentage of that tax base is to the overall general fund.
Sure.
But if you're taking that away, you're definitely decreasing education funding, because now those funds aren't there. And if you replace it with something that is totally exempt from taxation and only exists to pay back bonds, you've also now done the exact same thing. So I know folks say, it's not made up money, it's future money, et cetera. Or I think Jeremy Aguero called it a coupon. Fine. It's still public money at the end of the day. So they can get cute and reroute it and pretend that it's not real money right now and it will be in the future. But the fact of the matter is, general funds are what's paying the transferable tax credits. You're now decreasing your tax liability. And if that entire stadium district exists only to pay off those bonds, that's money that's not going to the county to pay off anything else, whether that's roads or kick it up to the general pot, which gets to education.
And the Nevada State Education Association, and thus, the Schools Over Stadiums PAC, the question that you guys are hoping to get on the ballot, does that revoke and repeal all of those different pots that you just mentioned, or just the state piece of this public funding?
So it only repeals, ideally we would have loved to repeal the entire thing. I still think we could have. There was just a very unique question of law that hadn't been settled. And at the end of the day, we kind of said that's almost as risky as giving public money away to a stadium and expecting a great result. So Steve Hill, who's the chairman of the Stadium Authority and also CEO of the Las Vegas Convention Authority, we'll let everybody read into the conflicts of interest there. There's plenty of reporting on it. But he had made a comment that basically we'll just beat the teachers to the ballot. We'll sign all our contracts, and then by the time they get to the ballot, there's nothing to there. There's a contract impairment clause issue. Nobody can vote for it now. There's some validity to that, as cynical of an approach that it is for him. But, so if they did complete all of their development agreements before Nevadans could vote, it's an untested issue in the courts. So what we ended up doing was researching a lot on this issue, because there's those two pots, the transferable tax credits and the county bonding. If you just attack the county bonding, and remove that pot of, $120 million, one, we think the whole thing's a house of cards. We think if you remove that large, it's basically half of it. John Fisher needs literally every penny. And I think that's all we've learned over the last year from this guy is that he's very cheap and doesn't want to do anything himself. So if you remove that, the deal probably stops. So what we ended up doing was we're attacking particular sections 29 and 30 of Senate Bill 1, which deals with the state taxes that back the bonds as well as the credit enhancement. So the language within the bill basically reserves the state's ability to amend or repeal related provisions rather. So that disclaimer language is included. And because it's included, we can put that to the ballot and Nevadans can vote on that. So that's why we structured it a certain way. Again, ideally, we would have done the entire thing based on how much they've dragged their feet and how far behind schedule they are. We probably could have gotten the whole thing to the ballot, but it wasn't worth the risk. And again, this was probably the smarter, more adaptable way to do things because, again, you're still removing half the funding. And without half the funding, they're still not going to be able to build the stadium, at least not with public funds. They would have to make it up in their own, which at this point, we've all indications are that they don't want it. If they don't have public money, they're not coming here.
That leads into my next question, which is what were to happen if this ballot question were to pass and all of a sudden the public money is removed? It doesn't automatically void all of SB1, just the public funding piece, but you guys believe that in turn will cause the entire deal and move to Vegas to collapse?
Correct. So I think the reason we structured it that way is because, we've been saying from the get-go, and this again kind of goes back to when you haphazardly write a bill the way the legislature did, you're going to overlook some things. So if you get rid of half of the funding, and they were at the session and they said they needed every single dime from that deal, we've at least saved the taxpayer $120 million, probably more with the way the deal is structured. But then it probably doesn't get built at all because they need every dollar. And they've said so much in session. So that was the reason it ended up at $380 million. It wasn't, we only need 180 in transferable tax credits and we're good to go. This owner does not want to invest in our community unless we give him public money. And I think the move to Sacramento kind of shows that as well. We can get into that. That's a little bit of a different story. But I think, if you pull that money out, I think the whole deal falls apart. And if it doesn't, he'll have to fund his own bonds or whatever he'll have to figure out to fund that portion of the deal. And that's better for Nevadans, right? They should get to choose what happens to their public money. And at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. So if that's the option we can put on the ballot for folks to say, yes, I want this amount of money going to John Fisher, great, vote for it. If you don't, vote against it.
And to be sure, NSCA and Schools Over Stadiums, you guys aren't wholly opposed to the project in and of itself, just the fact that public dollars are being spent on it, right?
Correct. It's always been a priorities thing for us. When we're 48th in the nation in public education, and again, the largest class sizes, highest vacancy rates, you were at session, you saw a lot of the bills that didn't get hearings. So, we had a bill to reduce our class size run by a member of ours, Selena LaRue Hatch up in Reno, didn't even get a hearing. They told us it was too expensive. And I think the fiscal note on that was around 250 to 300 million. That's a lot of money. And they told us as much, which is why it didn't get a hearing. But then, several weeks later, John Fisher's looking at a check for $380 million. So if that's too expensive, why is that not too expensive? There were bills to address summer school. There was a bill to provide campus security monitors and universal school lunches as well, all vetoed. Yet for some reason, we need a special session for a stadium. So, those are bills that affect Nevadans every day. Those are in a positive way. A stadium's not going to affect them in a positive way. I always like to kind of point out that we have this thing called the Commission on School Funding, right? Their main goal is to figure out how to get Nevada to optimal funding in the next 10 years and then figure out a 10-year plan every other year. So it's just a continuous 10-year plan. They have that plan. They gave the preliminary plan back in 2021 last 4 years. So each year right before session. So 4 years they've provided a plan. It's basically property and sales tax. I know that gives everybody heartburn, but that's the way to do it. That's what everybody else is doing. And we got to be the adults in the room and say, if we want to really get there, we got to do it. But nowhere in that plan does it mention the word stadium. Because if that was our magic fix, build 10 of them. But it's not. So that's why they don't. But I think, that goes back to what we're saying is, you want a baseball stadium, build it yourself. That's fine. We're not, I love sports. I've been a baseball fan my entire life, but doesn't have to have with public funding. And that's where our folks are focused. If Vegas is this great new market and they want to expand, great. We would welcome them with open arms. It's just a matter of, between the recent polling we saw, like folks want our elected officials to be focusing on roads, schools, essential services, right? Essential services that everyday Nevadans have to deal with or overcome. And a stadium is not going to help that out. And they know that. And I think that's why it's showing up in polling. And I think, it's not just Nevada. The same issue was on the ballot in Jackson County, Missouri last week, and it won 58%. They said, go build your own stadium, Mr. Billionaire.
We won't get too deep in the weeds on the legal arguments. I'm not a lawyer. You weren't making the arguments in the courtroom yesterday, but just briefly, the case from the other side was essentially that schools over stadiums did not include the full text of Senate Bill 1, which I think is 60 some odd pages. And therefore, by only including the pieces that schools over stadiums seeks to repeal, it doesn't have the full context of what would be left standing if this referendum were to pass in November. How would you guys respond to that argument that it could make things more confusing for voters?
We would disagree. I think, when you look at the phrase full text of the measure proposed, we are only proposing 4 sections. We have met that burden. We believe we've always met that burden. I always find it rich when opposing counsel assumes that Nevadans are just too dumb to understand things and then says, but what will really help that is another additional 40 pages. We think that would be actually more confusing because then, as our attorney said, you'd have one change on this page and then you'd have to flip 11 pages just for a minor change in one section and then 23 more pages until you get to actually what we're trying to do. We think that would be onerous and burdensome to the average voter, but we can explain what these 4 sections would do with the folks that we're going to have out there. We don't think this is confusing. Again, you have 200 words to be able to challenge this. We think we've met that burden where if you pull out the ability to pay back taxes, as our referendum says, the stadium may not get built. That doesn't mean that he doesn't swoop in and make up the difference privately. It just means that funds wouldn't be there. So in terms of, and I think even the judges admitted that 200 words was difficult to do, but the full text of the full text requirement hasn't been challenged. So it was an interesting legal discussion. But I think, at the end of the day, it has really nothing to do with what's going on the outside of that courtroom, which is people don't want to have to pay for this stadium. And we're just trying to give them that choice. So I think, we've met that burden. It'll be interesting to see what the court says. And, I think we made a compelling argument more so than the other side did. But again, I can't predict how the Supreme Court's going to rule. And if I could, I'd tell you.
It'd be doing something, making a lot more money than this. So.
I'd go talk to Otani's guy and see if we can't figure out something.
Time is running out, and that was something that your group's lawyer tried to impress upon the justices yesterday. The deadline to gather signatures is end of June, I believe the 26th. How many signatures, again, would be needed, and why is that so critical to get a decision quickly?
Yeah, so we have about 77 days left. We asked for an immediate decision reversing and dissolving the district court ruling. We didn't get that immediately, but I don't necessarily think we can read into that. Maybe that's just not how they do things and rule from the bench. But, if you don't ask, then you don't get it. So where we go from here, obviously, we're kind of waiting on, if we get a complete win, we'll be out there gathering signatures 10 minutes after. If we get a partial win, I guess that would kind of mean they might have some changes, or maybe they agree we should print the full text, for example. Not that we think that, that's our error or anything, but if that's hypothetically what they say, it just depends. Obviously a decision today is better than 3 weeks from now. We know we're up against the window, but I think at the end of the day, this is why billionaires don't want these things on the ballots. They know if this is on the ballot, they're going to lose. We have that Emerson College polling, which shows the support for publicly funded stadiums is underwater 20%. We saw what happened in Missouri. So they know what's going on out there. They know the public is not going to support this. So they have to do whatever they can to, whether that's wasting legal fees or delaying this as long as they can, but we have options. I think, I'm not necessarily saying we've talked about this, but hypothetically there's, the 2026 option. This language is still in state law. So If the court tells us exactly what to fix, if anything, and we've run out of time, there's a possibility of doing this in 2026. There's a possibility of challenging it in federal court and getting our deadline extended, because this is just a tactic that, folks are using just to sue on referendums and delay and waste money. So we've got a lot of options. We'll see what the court says. Ideally, we will get this to the ballot in November, but we can't say for certain how long it'll take for the Supreme Court to do that. But even though the window's closing, we still do have time. We're talking with vendors. We've got an army of volunteers from all over the state, as well as Oakland, ready to bust themselves out and go gather signatures for us.
So you'd be bringing Oakland A's fans up here to start gathering signatures?
They're excited. Yeah, they're not obviously going to be signing it because they can't legally sign it, but they can go gather signatures for us. And I always point out it's kind of funny when folks are like, "Oh, all Nevadans are going to come to this ballpark." It's closer from Oakland to the Reno to Oakland Coliseum than it is from Reno to where they're proposing the ballpark in Vegas. So it's a few-hour drive. We were out there for the Fans Fest and the opening day boycott, and plenty of folks from Reno drove out to help us out and volunteer. And they're excited. They just want to keep their team. That's kind of the strategic alignment we have, where we're trying to keep public money and public services, and they're trying to keep their team. And we can make both of those things happen.
And politics makes for strange bedfellows. We've got all the teachers and educators in Nevada, and then Oakland athletics fans kind of banding together here. We will, of course, await a decision from the Nevada Supreme Court. Thank you so much, Alexander, for speaking with us. We really appreciate it, and we'll wait and see what happens. But thanks for joining us for this episode of Ballot Battleground Nevada. Come back anytime.
Thank you. Appreciate your time, Ben.
Now we wait. It's unclear how fast the court will move when it comes to deciding on these proposed ballot questions, but they can't wait too long with that signature deadline getting closer by the day. Of course, we'll let you know what happens on News 4, as well as here on Ballot Battleground Nevada. If you made it to the end of this episode, we really appreciate it. If you have episode ideas, guest ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, feel free to shoot us an email. We'd love to hear from our listeners at my email, bjmargiott@sbgtv.com, with Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. And if you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and review. That helps the podcast show up higher in searches so more people can discover our show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.